Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're seeing a few more people start to come in, so we're just going to allow maybe another minute to 90 seconds for people to get settled in, and then we'll get going. I'm seeing a few more people have just come in. Hello and welcome. We're just giving everybody a couple minutes to get settled in, and then we'll get started. Another 30 seconds or so. Okay, I think we will get started. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Marquito. I'm the VP of Marketing and Public Affairs with the ALS Society of Canada. Thank you very much for taking the time today to join us for our advocacy webinar entitled "The Time is Now." We will be providing you today with an overview of the position paper that we published at the end of June on the topic of access to therapies. But before we dive in, I just want to cover off a few housekeeping notes, and for people who are still joining, again, that'll give you maybe a little bit more time to get settled. So we have upwards of 30, we might get to 40 or more people who have signed on today. So just from a practical and logistical standpoint, everyone's lines have been muted. That said, we do welcome your questions. And so what we are requesting is that if you do have a question to submit at any time during the course of the webinar, just use the question box function. And the reason why we're asking for you to use that function is because it actually leaves us with a record of your question even after the webinar is done. So in the event that we're not able to get to every question, we will be able to follow up with you afterwards. And like I said, anytime you have a question to submit, please use the question box to do that. But what we'll be doing is addressing all the questions at the end of the webinar. We are recording this webinar, including the Q&A session at the end. And we'll be publishing it on our YouTube channel within 1 to 2 weeks from today. And I know we had received some questions in advance about whether or not it will be recorded. So yes, it will. You're welcome to go back and view it after the fact. And like I said, it will be up on our YouTube channel probably within 1 to 2 weeks of today. So in terms of our agenda for today, it's quite robust. You can see everything listed on the slide here. Over the next 45 minutes or so, you'll be hearing from a few different speakers who will take you through the different parts of the agenda. So we have Tammy Moore with us today. She's the CEO of ALS Canada. We have Ryan Clark, who's the president of Advocacy Solutions. Ryan is a subject matter expert on the drug access pathway, and he teaches and trains people and organizations on how to effectively advocate for patient needs. Lauren Palplak is our Manager of Public Affairs and Communications. She will be speaking about how to take action towards the end of our time together today. And for anyone who joined after I'd already introduced myself, I'll do so again. I'm Lisa Marquito. I'm the VP of Marketing and Public Affairs with the ALS Society of Canada. Okay. So what you can expect over the next 45 minutes or so is to receive an overview of the position paper. The time is now. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with it, and that's what brought you to us today. You will learn about the current pathway for how drugs go from being approved by Health Canada through to actually being accessible through public drug plans. We're going to be using the word reimbursement a lot over this webinar, and when we talk about reimbursement, we're basically talking about a drug being covered by a provincial drug plan. So saying, is this covered by, you know, the Ontario government, by the BC government, et cetera. That's what we mean when we talk about reimbursement. And you'll learn about 2 solutions for shortening the timeline for access. And those are the solutions that are proposed in the position paper. And you will also find out what you can do to advocate for these solutions within your province. So first, we're going to start just as some context with an overview of our organization, the ALS Society of Canada. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Tammy Moore, and she will provide some information about our mission and how advocacy fits within it.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you everyone for being here today. When I think about my journey and how it started with ALS back in 2008, at that time we had one therapy that had been approved. And even since then, we've learned a lot about the efficacy of that particular therapy. And then I reflected as we saw that Radicava came into market, and now we're seeing a new drug that has been applying to Health Canada, and what we can anticipate is seeing potentially multiple drugs in the upcoming years. So this particular webinar is a very important step in that process as we start to really make sure that there are pieces in the system that respond to the needs of our community. So just to give you a quick overview about ALS Canada and some of the work that we do, you can really look at it in 3 different areas. We're path navigators. So within the province of Ontario, similar to the services that other societies provide in each of the provinces, we help to fill the gaps. So right from the very day that somebody is diagnosed, our regional manager may be there to have made a connection, or a community lead may be there to have helped make that connection and help them to understand what resources are available, what information they may need, and then as they're going through their experience with ALS, to provide equipment. With the next step being progress makers. So we think about the research that we invest in through our grant program, through the different work that we do to make sure that there are resources and capacity building across the country. And then rabble rousers, and that's why we're here today. It's about making sure that the voices and the needs of the ALS community are heard in the different areas that are responsible to provide that particular support, whether it's the provincial support that's required or on a larger scale nationally as well. So as we think about it, within Ontario, that's about 1,000 people who are living with ALS in the course of a year that we're helping, not only the person who's received the diagnosis, but also their families, their caregivers, making sure that the information is provided. And then when we think about the work that we do nationally, that's helping to support about 3,000 Canadians who are actively living with ALS at any time, as well as making sure that their community members also have the information necessary to do the advocacy work that's required. And of course, helping to provide for the research program. When we go into our strategic impacts, and these strategic impacts came out of a very intensive, extensive strategic planning exercise that our board and our organization went through in 2017, 2018. And in fact, we went back and we did a double check and kind of touch base on where we were in this past fall as well, just to make sure it was still very relevant. And in fact, we found that we had been very forward-looking in the strategic impacts that come forward. We recognize that this isn't work that we will do alone, but instead that it takes an entire community, an entire ALS ecosystem to make change in these areas. The things that we want to see are, one, that people affected by ALS receive the best possible standard of care. So whether it's the best practice recommendations that were published last year, but had a team of clinicians across the country working on for many years, and we provided the support to make sure it was there, or whether it is the work that we do to be able to make sure that there is administrative support for the CALs, the ALS clinicians across the country. That is some of the work that we do to make sure that the best possible standard of care is there for people affected by ALS. Number 2 is more treatments are available to improve quality of life and extend lifespan. And that's just not about advocating in the future. That's about the outreach that we do early on. It's about those connections that David Taylor, our VP of Research, has made years and years in advance, when drugs are very early on in the discovery phase, when they're just being contemplated, making sure that the companies are aware of Canada when we think about clinical trials, when we think about when they're ready to start thinking about coming to Canada. And then number 3 is people are empowered to make informed decisions about ALS. That can be making sure that government and the healthcare system understands the needs of our community. That can also be about making sure that our community has information so that they are empowered to make effective decisions for themselves. But all of these work together to be able to support the community. And it's not just within the province of Ontario or nationally that we work. We're also pushing these agendas forward internationally. So we're working internationally in a collaboration with other ALS organizations to be able to learn and to share. and also to be able to bring forward the needs of the ALS community from the standpoint of even the advocacy aspects and how can we collectively move these agendas forward. So all very important work that ALS Canada is doing to be able to advance advocacy and access to therapies, which is where we're prioritizing and focusing our efforts today. Lisa, back over to you.
Alrighty, so there are a couple of reasons why access to therapies is our single biggest advocacy priority right now. First, the process by which new drugs become accessible to Canadians is incredibly confusing and it takes far too long. We have seen this firsthand. Health Canada approving a drug, and many of you will know this as well, Health Canada approving a drug does not mean that someone can immediately access it in an affordable way. It often takes several years and sometimes more than that before a province would decide to cover or reimburse a drug. Secondly, we're at a critical juncture in the development of ALS therapies. So Tammy mentioned the drug Radicava. It was approved by Health Canada several years ago. It took until 2020 until the first provinces decided to cover it. And there's one province that still has not made a decision about whether to publicly reimburse the drug. There is another therapy, AMX 0035, that may be entering Health Canada review this summer or fall. Amylyx, the company that manufactures that drug, has signaled to Health Canada that they would like to put the drug forward for Health Canada review, and a decision from Health Canada on that is pending. And looking at the pipeline of therapeutic development, as Tammy said, we see a likelihood of other therapies coming forward for approval in the years ahead. And what we also know is that the one thing that people living with ALS do not have is time. This is a disease that takes so much from people in a very short period. There is no place for red tape, for drawn out processes when it comes to making decisions about whether a drug already approved by Health Canada will be covered. And it certainly shouldn't come down to which province you live in. So that is why we developed our position paper. We published it on June 21st, which is Global ALS Awareness Day. Like I said, I expect that many of you are on this webinar because you've read it and seen it, or it could be that you've participated in the advocacy campaign, but actually haven't had the opportunity yet to dig into what's in the position paper. So if that is you, this webinar is perfect for you as well, because it will give you an overview. We approached our position paper from a place of finding solutions. We know what isn't working. So what we wanted to do was identify what would work better and put that in front of government. The Canadian ALS community is looking for a change to the status quo. We saw this last fall. ALS advocate Norman McIsaac went to MP Heather McPherson and had her sponsor an e-petition in the House of Commons. That e-petition, and I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with it, that was part of a grassroots movement all across Canada. It received more than 25,000 signatures, and it called on the federal government to work with stakeholders across the country on a project that would streamline the drug access pathway following Health Canada approval, so that people could access those therapies more affordably and more equitably. And that petition was formally presented in the House of Commons, and it was endorsed by the All-Party ALS Caucus. Following that e-petition, we consulted across the Canadian ALS community, and so by that I mean people living with ALS, caregivers, ALS clinicians, ALS Society staff and volunteers, and we asked for their feedback to inform the position paper, which we see as a foundational document for our own advocacy work and in support to community-led advocacy as well. And what we found is that there's a place for organizations like ALS Canada and for individual community members, including patients and caregivers, to work together to create the change that we all want to see. So what we're going to do now is just dive into the position paper itself, starting with the current access processes for therapies. And Ryan Clark is going to take us through this next section. So Ryan, over to you.
Great, thanks Lisa. Appreciate the opportunity to be with everybody today. So as Lisa said, I'm going to take you through the paper. I'm not going to go through all of the paper, but we're going to hit some of the highlights. And as Lisa said, we'll start with the current drug access processes in Canada. So there are three things that we want to point out from the outset of the paper, that we do point out from the outset of the paper. First of all, the Canadian drug approval and reimbursement processes in this country do not function in such a way that reflect the realities of the typical disease trajectory in ALS. They're too lengthy, the processes, and unpredictable for people who have an average life expectancy of 3 years post-diagnosis or symptom onset. Number two, there is no streamlined ALS-specific approval or reimbursement pathway to replicate elsewhere in the world. We looked and we couldn't find anything, nor are there any broader rare disease approval or reimbursement pathways globally that could be modeled for ALS therapies in Canada. Again, we looked and we couldn't find any. And then finally, previously with some rare diseases and more recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been proven that when there is an urgency to having treatments approved and accessible to people through public funding, this can be done in a very expedited manner, which we're going to talk about momentarily. So on the next slide, you can see the current drug approval and reimbursement processes that we put up in the paper in terms of the timing of these processes. Many variables can affect the pace of a drug's journey through approval to reimbursement, including the good faith role of the submitting pharmaceutical company. In recent years, there has been greater transparency around the time frames of some of these processes, whereas others, such as PLAs, the bottom bucket there, called product listing agreements, remain unclear. So according to publicly available information, the numbers in the boxes, so you can see them there, Health Canada, 180 calendar days, CADITH, NS, PCPA, all those numbers you see there, are what we're calling target or aspirational timeframes provided by the various organizations and processes involved in the approval and reimbursement of drugs in Canada. However, a review of 8 rare disease drugs illustrates a very different overall reality for patients, as is suggested in the paper. To date, none of those 8 medications are publicly funded across the entire country, including one that was approved by Health Canada more than 11 years ago, is still not completely publicly accessible. So while isolated elements of the drug approval and reimbursement processes do meet their target timeframes, that's true, the bigger, more relevant picture cannot be ignored. Canadian patients with rare diseases and their families are not getting timely access to treatments across the country. And yet, when we look at vaccines, and specifically the pandemic, by way of contrast, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that when governments want to move, they can move, and they can move quickly. With an urgent need to ensure that as many Canadians were protected from the virus as quickly as possible, the federal government approved the first vaccine in just 61 days and stepped in as the public payer for those same approved COVID-19 treatments. So let me be clear. They did 2 things. The federal government did 2 things. They approved quickly, 61 days, and they agreed to pay for it, thereby ensuring that just 5 days after approval, the first vaccine was in people's arms. This is a truly remarkable feat. We're talking 66 days from submission to in someone's arm. Compare that with the 8 rare disease drugs I just told you about and that are profiled in the position paper, one that still hasn't been approved, one that still hasn't been reimbursed across this country 11 years after Health Canada's approval. So if we move now to the recommendations, I want to discuss how the paper contemplates to resolve the delays in approval and public reimbursement for ALS medications. And there are 2 of them. Pathway A and Pathway B is what we decided to call them, and they are not mutually exclusive, meaning that both can and should be adopted. This is not choose one, choose the other. We're suggesting both should be chosen because they play different roles, as you'll see. So the first one, Pathway A, is an interim funding mechanism for all ALS treatments, which serves as a bridge to the second solution, Pathway B, which would be for all ALS treatments to proceed through condensed and predictable approval and reimbursement processes. And further to pathway B, that condensed time frame should be no more than 18 months from when a pharmaceutical company's submission is accepted by Health Canada all the way through to public reimbursement by all of the provinces and territories. However, and the position paper makes this point, I want to emphasize this. 18 months, which is contemplated for pathway B, we'll get into this more in a second as we move along, is just a first step. It's a first goal. Given that the average life expectancy is 3 years, the ALS community ultimately needs the time frame condensed down even further to ensure expedited and equitable long-term access to medications. So if we move now to more of the specifics of pathway A, to support this interim funding mechanism, that's what we're calling it, we're suggesting that an expert committee of practicing ALS physicians in Canada should be established. In addition to providing further clarity as to how such a mechanism for ALS should operate, this committee would be tasked with ensuring the development, if necessary, and adoption of applicable clinical criteria and prescribing guidelines. This would ensure that the ALS patients who stand to benefit from a new treatment are able to access it in both a quick and efficient manner. On the next slide, to further support the idea of an interim funding solution for ALS treatments, the position paper reviews some examples to build upon. It was very important for us to suggest in this paper that this pathway A, the interim funding solution, was not just made up. It's based on things that have occurred. And 3 things in particular that the paper highlights. The first one is the case of Esbriet. In April 2013, Esbriet for the treatment of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, or IPF, received an initial do not list recommendation from CADTH. And yet both Ontario in August of 2014 and New Brunswick in October of 2014 decided to publicly fund Esbriet on an interim basis pending a resubmission by the company to CADTH, with that resubmission ultimately resulting in a list with clinical criteria and conditions recommendation in April of 2015. Our second example is a drug called Soliris for the treatment of atypical HUS. It received an initial do not list recommendation from CADTH in July 2013. That recommendation was upheld in August of 2015, approximately 2 years later, through a CADTH request for advice report. However, in February of 2015, Ontario announced interim funding for Soliris for AHUS patients who met defined clinical criteria. And finally, Zolgensma, a gene therapy used to treat SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, was approved by Health Canada in December of 2020, relatively recently. Within a month, both Ontario and Alberta announced that they would ensure that they had interim funding mechanisms in place by which families and children suffering from SMA could access the drug. Those announcements were made even before CADTH issued their list with conditions recommendation, even before the recommendation came out, and that was in March of 2021. Now, just a note, none of these examples, the 3 examples that I mentioned, were permanent. And given the relentless nature of ALS's progression, people living with the disease must be able to access a permanent interim funding mechanism for approved treatments. This is an interim funding mechanism, but we want it permanently in place. And that's what Pathway A contemplates. Now to Pathway B, where the paper suggests condensing down the entire series of processes to 18 months as a first step. And we're suggesting it be done as follows. In terms of Health Canada and the HTA, or Health Technology Assessment processes in this country, we fully expect that all new drug submissions for ALS will be granted priority review moving forward. That's by Health Canada. And equally as important is the provision that allows CADTH and NS, the 2 health technology assessment bodies in this country, to accept submissions from pharmaceutical companies up to 6 months prior to the issuance of a notice of compliance from Health Canada. This is in place now. This exists, and all we're suggesting is that all ALS treatments go through this expedited process. Secondly, when you move to HTA or CADTH-NS to PCPA, Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, if concurrent review processes can occur between Health Canada and CADTH-NS, which they do, CADTH in particular, then the same can surely occur between CADTH and PCPA. These early discussions will inform what will ultimately be the content of a letter of intent at PCPA and help move it along more quickly. And contemplated perhaps a panel of treating clinicians could provide guidance at this stage to PCPA, similar to the expert committee we suggested in Pathway A. And then finally, PCPA and product listing agreements. So after the drug gets its letter of intent and goes to the provinces to negotiate individual product listing agreements. In essence, the PCPA is the provinces and territories acting with additional participation by the federal public drug plans. The choice to enter into a PLA is within the exclusive jurisdiction of each of the provinces and territories and those federal drug plans. Given this jurisdictional commonality, this is the argument we're making in the paper. Given this jurisdictional commonality, we believe that all LOIs and PLAs that pertain to ALS treatments should be concluded in a timely and concurrent manner. As well, while the PCPA allows jurisdictions to opt out of individual negotiations, we are requesting that the provinces and the territories explicitly forego opting out of any condensed timeframe model in the case of ALS. And perhaps without explanation, the need for a Pathway B is further illustrated by the recent example of Radicava, which Lisa mentioned, which is still not accessible to all Canadians living with ALS, well over 3 years after it was initially submitted to Health Canada for review. So on the next slide, if implemented, this is what the two pathways would look like from a timing perspective. And again, as Lisa mentioned, it's just in time because on June 14th, 2021, Emmalinx Pharmaceuticals filed a new drug submission to Health Canada for 0035 for the treatment of ALS. So we have a therapy that could benefit from these pathways that are described in the paper. And now just to wrap up, just 2 more slides from me. Here is how the recommendations appear in the position paper. Again, coexisting and running concurrently. And then finally, the time is now. The paper then turns to the call to action, which is what we will discuss next. And I'll hand it over to Lauren to do so.
Thank you, Ryan. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So my name is Lauren Poplack, and I am the Manager of Public Affairs and Communications at ALS Canada. Like Ryan and Lisa said, I will be talking to you today about how you can take action to support the position paper, The Time Is Now. So we have developed an e-advocacy campaign grounded in the position paper that gives the ALS community the opportunity to send a letter to their provincial elected official, so your MPP, your MLA, your MNA, urging them to support the implementation of the solutions put forward in the paper. This is the opportunity to tell elected officials that it's unacceptable to make Canadians with ALS wait years to access new treatments once they've been approved by Health Canada. This campaign is a first step in educating government on the issues of access to therapies, priming them for future advocacy. The campaign, as we said, is focused on outreach to provincial and territorial governments, as this is where decisions pertaining to public reimbursement are made. And by targeting provincial elected officials, your MPPs, MLAs, MNAs, will also enable the community to leverage these engagements for the greatest grassroots advocacy. So many of you on the webinar today will have already participated in this campaign and sent your letter. For those who have not, we do encourage you to join the nearly 6,000 Canadians who have already participated to date and send a letter to your local elected official. The campaign is focused provincially, as I said, so the Minister for Health in your province will be CC'd and will receive a copy of your letter. As well, the Federal Health Minister will receive a copy just as a means to increase awareness and engagement around this campaign. If you have already participated, we encourage you to please share any responses you have received with advocacy@als.ca. So now looking at what comes next. So over the summer, the e-advocacy campaign will continue as we prime elected officials for future advocacy. We're already looking at some MPPs in Ontario who have received a certain amount of letters and are working on a strategy to engage those MPPs for meetings before the summer, or before the summer ends, I should say. And then as we look at the fall onward, there will be additional opportunities for advocacy for those who are interested. We'll be providing more information on that at a later date, but please be aware that there are potential for federal and or provincial opportunities as we look to the fall onward for those individuals who are interested in taking a further step beyond just sending a letter and sharing the position paper. So I'm going to toss it back over to Lisa now to sort of wrap up our webinar.
Alrighty, and for those, we will be doing a Q&A at the end as well in the next couple of minutes, so please do keep those questions coming if you've got them. I'm really just summarizing what we've been talking about over the past half hour or so. So it's an urgent issue. I don't need to tell you that. It's vital that every Canadian living with ALS today and in the future has faster access to therapies that are proven to be safe and effective. The position paper is, like Lauren said, a first step. It's foundational, it's grounding, it is something that we have as documentation and something to put in front of government so that our asks are clear. And we don't want it to be a position paper that just, gets published and you can go and read it and that's it. And so that's why we're looking to leverage it into the fall with some more targeted advocacy. And for those of you who are interested in, for example, meeting with your elected officials in your province, we'll have, that's what Lauren was alluding to, and we will have an opportunity to connect more in the coming months in terms of what that can look like, in addition to the work that we're already starting to do, where we're looking at patterns of MPPs who have received a lot of letters already and starting with those ones. We're doing that into August and probably early September, and then there'll be a more focused effort from there. So more opportunity to get involved for those who are interested. And as I think Ryan said, there is a therapy right now that, again, we're looking to Health Canada's decision about whether to green light it to move through the approval process. And should Health Canada decide to do that, then the timing for all of this work to be happening will be really ideal, because we're not just talking about theoretically something that can happen. We will have a real live case study that we can work with, and it will give us something very specific to advocate for and rally around. So that is a summary of the position paper and the advocacy pieces that are in support of it as well. I know Lauren has been looking at the questions as they've been coming in. Again, I don't know that we'll get to every question in the next while. If we do not answer your question, don't worry, we will follow up with you. And Lauren, I might turn it back to you to field our Q&A session if there are any questions.
Absolutely, thank you. So we do have a question that has come in around the role of PMPRB. So neither pathway A nor B refer to the role and timeline of PMPRB, which also undertakes value for money. Why was that not included in the proposed pathways?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll respond to that and then maybe ask for Ryan to add additional context from his part. We published the position paper on the 21st of June, and as we were developing it, some of you will know, and some of you who have been kind of following PMPRB along the way would be aware that it was possible that new PMPRB reforms would have come into effect as of July 1. So we didn't, because of the uncertainty around PMPRB, we didn't want to basically date ourselves or make anything in the position paper irrelevant because of what was or wasn't in it about PMPRB. In addition, it's really the reimbursement piece in terms of accessibility to Canadians and reimbursement within public drug plans that is such a tremendous and gap isn't the right word, but that's where we see the delays happening. So that's where we wanted to focus. And also from an advocacy perspective, that's where we saw having the greatest potential to influence as well. So those are a few of the reasons why. Ryan, I don't know if there's anything else you would want to add.
Yeah, I think two things to add, Lisa. First of all, the PMPRB process, as many of you may know, doesn't just initiate at the beginning of a drug's submission to Health Canada or initial review by CADTH, but in fact, their jurisdiction runs all the way through. In fact, it doesn't really stop. In fact, it doesn't stop until the drug goes off patent. And so its engagement is constant, right from what is technically the date of first sale through to the drug going off patent. The other thing I'd mention too is that typically speaking, the PMPRB process, or again, that jurisdictional piece I just described, doesn't tend to delay publicly funded access. It doesn't tend to be part of the equation. That doesn't mean it's never part of the equation, but it doesn't tend to be part of the equation. And we just, I think in some ways made a strategic decision, in addition to what Lisa said, to not deal with it for some of those reasons. So, or not to highlight it for some of those reasons.
Wonderful, thank you. We don't have a question, but we do have a comment from one of the participants that the complex information was made very easy to understand. So thank you to Lisa and Ryan and Tammy for all your work in explaining that today. I will give everybody a couple more minutes. We have no other questions that have come in, so please remind everybody to use the question box. You can send your question in, and this will be an opportunity for us to answer them. We can also, I will just remind everybody again of the email address advocacy@als.ca. If you've received any responses, please send them that way. And if a question comes to mind following this webinar, you can also send that to advocacy@als.ca.
I might also add just that there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of jargon associated with this pathway and this process, and it is a lot to kind of take in. I think many of you who are attending today are have taken steps to unpack some of that, but there was a blog article that I think was provided as part of your webinar registration on our website where we talk in more detail about the different steps in the process. And so if that's something that you're needing or you would find helpful, again, drop a note to that advocacy@als.ca and we can get that out to you. And if we see a lot of demand for that, we'll find a more efficient way to get it to everybody. But just to say that there is a lot to learn and to unpack. And again, those of you who took the time to tune in today probably have a pretty good sense of that, but we do have those types of resources available if it's helpful for a refresher.
So a couple more questions that have come in. The first is the paper on the ALS Canada website? Yes, it is. If you go to our front page, you will see the time is now in our header where you can click through and access the paper. Also under the top advocacy drop-down menu, you will see an opportunity there to go to the page, the time is now. I'm going to just flip back on the slides very quickly to remind everybody, als.ca/the time is now is where the campaign is, and there is a link there to the position paper on that page. We also got a question about whether we are getting feedback from Health Canada.
Yeah, so the way that I'm interpreting that question is whether or not we're taking the position paper to some of those other players in government, in addition to the provinces that are the focus for the campaign. So yeah, I think we have not as of yet, but we will be putting this in front of the other some of the other parts and organizations involved within the pathway. Health Canada tends to be pretty transparent with their timelines, and again, we've seen the delays really more on the reimbursement side, but that's not to say there isn't opportunity within other areas of the pathway as well. So yes, we will be sharing it, even though it's not the primary audience at this point. There's value for sure.
I think building on that as well, Lisa, the question too might be, what happens when people do receive feedback? So when the letters have gone in, we have seen some of the people who have been participating in the Time Is Now letter writing campaign who have received comments back. It's very helpful for the organization, for ALS Canada, to be able to understand the way that the different parties are positioning. And so please make sure you send those to advocacy@als.ca. That way we can look at all of the responses and appropriately respond. So it's very helpful.
I'll give everybody one more or 30 more seconds for more questions. Don't see any more that have come. Oh, there is one question that has come in. Here we go. So, does the clinical criteria prescribing guidelines described exclude individuals who are excluded to participate in drug trials for various reasons?
Could you read that one more time, Lauren?
Sorry, yes, of course. So when we discuss the clinical criteria or prescribing guidelines as part of Pathway A, will those exclude participants who have participated in drug trials for various reasons?
I think it would depend on the clinical, I think it would depend on the data that's available for that drug. It would depend. And that would be the clinicians reviewing the data that's available and identifying those most likely to benefit. So I don't think it would, I wouldn't see it excluding on the face of it. It would be dependent on what's in the data.
And another question that came in is around experiencing when you first get diagnosed, and is there anything or anywhere where people can go for help? I think this sort of speaks to potentially both the ALS guide as well as the best practice recommendations, but is there a checklist that would be helpful for people who are first diagnosed?
Mm-hmm. So what I would say, and then Tammy, I'll invite you to jump in as well. And I don't know where the individual is based upon diagnosis, but certainly ALS societies across Canada would be a really important touch point. So I would say they would be important in terms of helping to navigate the system and understand what to expect and kind of receive that support and navigation guidance that is tailored to you and responds to your own information needs at the time. So within Ontario, for example, where the ALS Society of Canada provides support, we would have community leads who play that role, and they would work with people all across the province who are experiencing an ALS diagnosis, and be a source of information who can identify different resources available, different supports available, depending on the need. And then your clinical lead, so your ALS neurologist, is also from a medical and care perspective an essential contact as well. Tammy, I don't know if there's anything you would want to add.
And I think our website, again, having that access to the ALS guide would be helpful so that the information is available. So again, your first point of contact is your ALS clinic. Second point is your ALS society, and then the ALS Canada website has it, as well as a number of the other societies as well.
Depending on how that question has come in, we may be able to respond to that individual directly with a link to that guide. People like different types of information at different times, and so we are sensitive to the potential for information overload and wanting to kind of meet the person where they're at in terms of their need for information. But the guide is certainly really helpful and comprehensive from that perspective.
And so I will just follow up on what Lisa said. So I do have your name here as the asker and your email address as part of your registration, so we will be able to follow up. And so we've got, oh, please go ahead, Lisa. I was just going to say a last call for any further questions.
And we welcome any additional questions as well. I don't want to push the advocacy@als.ca email address one more time, but you are welcome to send us kind of your one-off questions there as well if you've got them. Lauren, if there's just a final check, anything else before we close it off?
While I give people 2 more seconds, I will just remind everyone what Lisa said off the start. This session has been recorded, and in a couple of weeks, we will look to be posting this as an archive so that if you'd like to go back and reference, share this with your network, we will have that available for you as well. So with that, I haven't seen any more questions come in, so I will toss it to you, Lisa, to close us off.
All right, thanks everybody for taking the time today. Grateful for your attention and for your support of this campaign as well. To be at nearly 6,000 letters at this point is quite significant. So we're really pleased. Please do let us know of responses you receive. As I said, there will be opportunities in the near future to engage in a more involved way if you would like to. So we'll stay in touch with you on that. And thank you very much for your time today, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.